So if you keep up with the channel, you know I'm deeply concerned about, the spiritual state of the world right now, the spiritual state of my own nation and my own civilization, really, Western civilization. I'm deeply concerned about these things, and I often pray for my nation and for other nations as well. And I'll talk a bit about why. For instance, as an American, I would care deeply about the United Kingdom and what's going on over there spiritually. But I do keep the Western world in general in my prayers, and of course the world itself. But I do keep my civilization in my prayers. I pray for it. And of course, I pray for revival. And I've been thinking about a passage in Exodus. This is right after the Egyptians are drowned in the Red Sea. And Moses, the Israelites are always complaining. Poor Moses, they always talk about Moses' temper. I think, considering Moses' situation, he was a very restrained man. The Israelites are always complaining. Poor Moses. And, the Israelites are complaining they want something to drink. And they find this saltwater sea. And Moses is told by God to throw this tree into this saltwater sea, and the water will become sweet. And he does it, and the water becomes sweet, and the Israelites have something to drink. And then in verse 26, this is 15:26, the Bible says, and said, if thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and wilt do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases upon thee, of which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord thy God that healeth thee. Interestingly, that's actually the first place in the Bible that God is called a healer. And of course, we would see that element of God's character much more in the four Gospels, when Jesus is always healing people. But I also am reminded of what Jeremiah says on this situation, talking back to this. He's talking about this same period. Well, this is actually God, but Jeremiah is writing this down. Anyways, Jeremiah 7, verse 22 and 23. For I spake not unto your fathers, nor commanded them in the day I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings or sacrifices. But this thing I commanded them, saying, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and ye shall be my people, and walk ye in all the ways that I have commanded you, that it may be well unto you. So Jeremiah talks about that, the first thing God commanded them before even sacrifices is to follow his voice and to be, he will be their God, and they will be his people and he will be their God. And of course, in Exodus, it tells us that God, if Israel kept his commandments and followed him, they would not suffer the same fate as the Egyptians. They would not have the same punishments as the Egyptians. And of course, we saw this throughout the Bible. When Israel followed God, Israel had a time of great prosperity. And when Israel forsook God, Israel was judged. And that's true today. I think in the Western world today, people have forgotten God and God's law. And now that's why everything's falling apart. I think it's simply the abandonment of God. And I know people are going to say mockingly, oh, you think God's going to judge the Western world? What do you think God's going to do? Send 100 hurricanes, send a bunch of tornadoes, send down lightning? They're going to say that sort of thing mockingly. And he can do that if he wants. But simply, as universalists, we believe that holiness and happiness are inseparably connected. So holy living and a good life are inseparably connected. And if you abandon the holy living, the good life will fade away with it. And that's what we're seeing today. Hebrews 11:25 says, sin has pleasure for a season. And I think right now we're seeing that sin is no longer pleasurable. In the late 20th century, this period of great material prosperity, a lot of sin was pleasurable and was becoming more and more tolerated as Western man increasingly forgot his religion. But now, the party's over. And now people are like, because, the moral structure and all this has faded away, all of a sudden the wealth and the prosperity and the good times, that's going away too. And now that that's happening, and man's greed and man's lust and all these things have, corrupted things. Man has forgotten God and God's law and God's way, and he's abandoned the law. He's abandoned God. Now we're reaping what we've sown, and that's what we're seeing today, is the negative fruits of forsaking God. So God doesn't have to do a thing. He doesn't have to send 1 million tornadoes or whatever. He just, we can destroy ourselves, quite frankly. because we've forgotten God's ways and God's law, and that will naturally bring its own ruin. And I think that's what we're seeing today in the Western world. We're seeing the abandonment of Christianity and Christianity's principles. And the fundamental problem with Western atheism, and I think a lot of Christians have focused far too much on the individual atheist. They're like, oh, how do you know what's wrong or what's right? There's a lot of atheists because I think God has, He's given us a conscience. And I think our conscience can decently lead us, not perfectly, but decently lead us into deciding what's wrong and what's right sometimes. But the problem is when you start talking about the society as a whole, that's really when you start having trouble. So the problem is not the individual atheist. There's plenty of atheists. Honestly, there are some atheists that live better lives, morally speaking, than some Christians. That's not really the trouble. The problem with atheism is on the societal level, things start to fall apart. And that's what we're seeing today. One thing you see from a lot of atheists, they'll try to mock the Bible because they'll say some verses in the Bible can be used to support slavery. And the problem with this is, who told you slavery was wrong? You believe slavery is wrong because you grew up in a Christian culture. The Romans didn't think slavery was wrong. They used to just work a slave to death and buy a new one because that was easier. The Muslims didn't think slavery was wrong. The Muslim world would still practice slavery if the Western world hadn't forced them to stop. They had no issue with it. Some Muslims will still brag about the fact their ancestors owned slaves and did slavery. It's because of the Western world that you believe slavery is wrong. And that's, of course, the absurdity of Western atheism. I think we've all seen that meme of that fella who's out on a cliff on a board, and he's got a gun, and he's going to shoot the fellow that's holding the board up. I mean, the fellow with the gun is atheism, and, of course, the fellow on the board is Christianity. And the problem with atheism is that all its moral presuppositions about the world come from Christianity. For instance, we're often told, well, we don't really need the Bible because as long as everybody just does what they want, unless they hurt anybody, unless they hurt someone, everything's going to be fine. The problem is that only even makes halfway any sense inside a traditionally Christian society. And most other societies in the world, that's absolute madness because they have completely different moral presuppositions about the world because they practice different religions. That only really makes sense inside the guilt-based culture of the West, which comes from Christianity. It doesn't, an idea of personal guilt and personal responsibility. It doesn't really make sense in a lot of other societies. And even in our own society, it doesn't make any sense. The problem is that's a very vague statement. You should be able to do what you want to do unless you hurt somebody else. Well, what do you mean by hurt? One person could do something they think is asinine, and they don't care, and to another person, it can be considered the most grave and horrible thing. And, that's the big problem. I think of that classic example going back to philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy. A ship is sank, and a guy's on the beam, and, he's surviving with that little debris of the ship, and another guy comes over and pushes him off, and that guy drowns. But the fellow says, well, this is self-defense. And from his perspective, it is self-defense. From that guy's perspective, he's done nothing wrong. He had to do what he had to do to survive. And that's kind of the issue. It's, what's right to one person is wrong to another. And that's what we're saying today, is that things are falling apart today because no one can agree what's right and what's wrong. So that's the problem of atheism. It fundamentally fails on the societal level. It may, you can have a fairly moral atheist, but you can't have a long-term atheistic society that works. Every historically Christian society that has abandoned Christianity, has been brought to ruin. We saw the first example, Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany. And yes, I know people be like, oh, well, Nazi Germany was actually Christian. No, it wasn't. They had a version of the Bible where they cut out the Old Testament and all the Jewish parts of the New Testament. So that's already the heresy of Marcionism. So already no Christian church would consider that to be Christian. And if you actually read their writings, the Nazis were pagans. They worshipped Odin, and they wanted Christianity to slowly be faded out of the society. They were pagans, not Christians. And of course, the Russians, the Soviets, were just straight atheists. And of course, people want to complain about, oh, the Christians, they're so cruel to atheists. How about you learn about what the atheists did to Christians in Soviet Russia and all the horrible things they did to Christians in Soviet Russia? Far worse than whatever, the Christians have done in this country, I can assure you that. Far, far worse. Not to mention communist China. But I digress. You know, we see, first in these societies. And now we're seeing it in our own society, where things that were once unthinkable, like we're seeing particularly in a lot of European countries, uh, Christians being arrested for speaking opinions that are unpopular. I mean, we're seeing in the United Kingdom today, people who post the wrong thing on social media are being arrested. And I think that's what side of the political aisle you're on. I think it's redundant here. Even if you don't like what they post, I think that's just ludicrous that somebody would be arrested. I was watching TV sometimes. I don't really watch the news honestly, but I did manage to catch an ad thing on CBS one time, and they were pretty much comparing the German system of free speech to the American system. And in Germany, they have this whole police force now where they'll go out there and they'll arrest you if you say the wrong thing. And then, of course, here in America, thanks be to God that we had the First Amendment, and we don't do that sort of nonsense here. Um, but like the fact that that was even being compared, because they were like, what system is better? So it's like the fact that that's even being perpetuated in this country is terrifying. And if you lose freedom of speech, you lose every other freedom. Um, it's just everything else goes. And it is horrifying to see that today. And that's all because, everybody should be able to do what they want unless they don't hurt anybody. What do you mean by hurt? And we see that today because can speech hurt somebody? According to a lot of people, it can. And I don't see that as a right wing or a left wing issue. Back in the 1960s, it was the left who were famous for being free speech advocates, and conservatives were more pro censorship. I don't see it as a political issue. I don't see it as me taking a side. I think that's just common sense, and it's in line with our tradition as people of English descent. Those ideas of freedom, those are very long running, and it's just very sad. But even if you're not of English descent, I mean, just if you're an American, it's just you're seeing this moral decay now, and we're seeing this moral falling apart. So that's why I do pray for the Western world. I see a lot of people in my generation. I spoke about this in my recent video, Thoughts on Being Gen Z, which was one of my more heartfelt ones. So go check that out if you want to. But I see a lot of folks in my generation. They're all very. I know this word has been so overused, but traumatized. I think a lot of folks in my generation are traumatized and hurting, and I blame the society we live in. I think there comes a certain point where, I do believe the individual has to take responsibility for their life, but there comes a certain point we can't blame the individual. If all these people are hurting and sick and miserable, there's something wrong with the society. And that's true. It's the society that has fallen apart. The institution of marriage has fallen apart in massive divorce rates, which, of course, comes from the abandonment of Christian morality. And then, of course, we raise all these children on social media, which is also an abandonment of Christian morality, the duty of the parent. And not just have the TV as the babysitter all the time. We see this today, and I think a lot of people are really hurting and suffering, and it really just makes me very sad to see all these people hurting and suffering and lost today. It's just, there's so much anger and hatred, and I really do believe that, of course, the solution is Christ. I think if everyone knew that God unconditionally loved them, no matter who they were, that, we are, as in Luke 15, we are the lost sheep, the one that the shepherd leaves the 99 to go save. We are the lost coin, and that coin is precious because that's essentially like, what if you lost your paycheck for that month? That's essentially what this woman found. She essentially, found her paycheck for the month. She had lost that, she'd be in big trouble. So she loved that coin. We're the lost coin, and of course, we're the prodigal son. We're the lost son that comes back home. We are that to God, and God loves us. In Luke 19:10, he talked about that the Son of Man came to save the lost, save sinners. All men are lost, all men are sinners. And of course, Christ famously on the cross says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And he's speaking about all people there, because all people put him on that cross. So, Jesus is the friend of the sinner. And I do think that if people really could see the Savior and know how much he loved him, I love them. I just think that there could be a great change in the world if men just stop being so hateful. I mean, I know this sounds like a bunch of hippie nonsense, but I mean, I really do. Um, I really do think that, I mean, if we just were to listen to God's voice, as Jeremiah speaks about, that there could be a great change. And that's why I'm deeply disappointed in the church too, because I see a lot of Christians, they're not helping, because a lot of people, they're getting into Christianity, but they're getting into Christianity for the wrong reason. They're not into Christianity because of God. They're into Christianity for themselves. A lot of people are getting into Christianity right now because it's a political alternative. The Western world has gone so liberal, so they're getting into, trad, as they call it, which is short for traditionalist Christianity. And, they're trying to be as, reactionary to the current status quo as possible. And I think this is the biggest thing the Christian church should fear, and that is that a marriage with the state. I think the biggest thing we should fear is Christianity becoming too involved with politics. Now, we should be involved with politics in some extent. I mean, I think the idea that Christians had to have that Christians, for instance, in voting, shouldn't allow their religion to inform their decisions is just plain tomfoolery. And definitely we do have some moral duty to help the society and to do good in the society. But, we need to be careful not to be married to the state. I think the biggest thing that would hurt Christianity is if we just got married to the state and just, became a lapdog to the state. I think that is the biggest problem and the biggest threat for the advancement of the gospel right now, is that a lot of Christians are becoming just married to the state and to the service of the state. And honestly, both sides are guilty of that. Both sides of Christianity, both the progressive and the conservative. I see liberal preachers essentially say that if you vote Republican, you're going to hell. I've heard them say that, and I mean that's not okay to say. I mean, the way someone votes shouldn't determine their standing with God, and that's the same if someone votes Democrat or as a leftist. That shouldn't determine their standing with God either. It's simply with their relationship with Christ determines their standing with God, not their political beliefs. And I think that's the biggest problem with Christianity today. We let the current political situation lead us around, and we don't lead the world. So that's why I do keep both my own nation, the United States, in my prayers, but also for the European nations. I know a lot of people might be, why would I care about Europe? I'm an American. Why should I care about what's going on over there? And that is because America is Europe. We are just, all America is what if you took the outcasts of European civilization and put them on another continent? That is all America is. America is Europe. Every group that comes here, I mean, pretty much everyone can trace their roots back to Europe. Everything started in Europe. That's why I think I've heard a lot of Europeans get confused when they'll be like, I'm an Italian American. Okay, that's my terrible Italian American accent. I'm an Italian American, or I'm an Irish American, or I'm a Swedish American. I'm a German American. I'm a Scottish American. They get confused. Why do we do that? Because that's where we hail from. We remember where we came from, and we continue to identify with our homeland. And, I mean, we are an extension of European civilization. And I particularly think about England. Everything we hold dear comes from England. Our government, everything. I mean, our government is based off Oliver Cromwell's government when they killed King Charles in the English Civil War. And they got rid of a king for a while. And our republic is based off Cromwell's republic. Our Bill of Rights is based off the English Bill of Rights of 1689, I want to say. Pretty much our Bill of Rights is based off that. I mean, we go back further, we can go back to the Magna Carta, which is kind of the seed that, would somewhat evolve into the U.S. Constitution. We can go back that far. I mean, all these things. America you can trace its roots back to England. I mean, the ideas of John Locke. And I'm scared particularly to see this erosion of rights in England today, because if it can happen in England, the place where classical liberalism, the ideology that America was based off of, all those ideas that you should have freedom of speech, freedom to bear arms, freedom of religion, all that stuff goes back to classical liberalism and English ideology. If those ideas die in England, they could die in the United States. And just... everything we hold dear, I mean, traces back to Europe. I'm reminded of what John Murray said in his biography, that, the land was different. The only thing he really recognized of the old world was the religion. And the religion, it traces back to Europe. And we should really keep Europe in our prayers, because if it can happen in Europe, if a lot of the tyranny we're seeing today can happen in Europe, It can happen here. We may be an ocean apart, but it can happen in America, and I dare say it will happen in America if there is not a change of course, if we do not return to our God. And, I'm horrified at the prospect of Europe falling to Islam, which is a very real possibility in today's world. Or going back to some form of paganism. That's another thing. It's not just people aren't just getting into Christianity for political reasons. There are a lot of people becoming neo-pagans. And if you just want to be the most right-wing, once again, I already spoke the Germans and the Nazis, they were pagans. If you want to be the most right-wing thing you can be a pagan. They were, you want to be sexist, be a pagan. Because, a lot of that red pill stuff, I spoke this before, a lot of that stuff, that goes back to a pagan view of women. Christians always cherish their wives. Christian men cherish their wives. They love them as Christ loved the church. There have been, of course, Christian men that have not treated their wives well, but a Christian man should cherish his wife, is what I mean. Pagan, it's the pagan Romans who spoke of women as these horrible creatures, as you're seeing a lot of folks on the far right do today. And, it's just, we need to return to Christianity. And I just keep my nation, the United States, in my prayers. And I pray for Europe, too. I've always been deeply concerned with the religious situation over there because it's worse in Europe than it is in America. It's more secular. And I'm deeply concerned. So I always keep Europe in my prayers. I pray for great revival amongst the Europeans because I do think it can happen. It just, of course, we need another John Wesley because it did happen before. In the 18th century in England, deism was on the rise, Christianity was weakening, and then came the Methodists. And the Methodists, they did a wonderful thing. They lit England on fire. John Wesley turned, George Whitefield, Charles Wesley, they turned everything around. And it was just this great revival. And it was just wonderful. And many came to Christ. And the Methodists, they did so much to help the poor. And all these wonderful charities started by the Methodists. And they did so much. And there was this great revival in England. And many believe that it's because of Wesley that England didn't have its own equivalent to the French Revolution because they didn't go through the same moral decay France was going to. And, God bless the Methodists. They saved England and they saved America. And I do think there can be revival, and I pray for revival. I see so many hurting people, and I think so many would be benefited from what John Wesley had. I think about John Wesley. He had the warming of the heart. He was a man burdened by guilt, like Martin Luther. In fact, he was at a revival meeting, and he was hearing the opening commentary of Luther's commentary on Romans. And Luther, he used to go to confession 6 hours a day, Luther. The priest got so tired of him, they just like, hey, how about you start teaching Bible study? Because they wanted to tire him out so he would go to sleep. And of course, that would eventually lead Luther to start reading the New Testament. And eventually start realizing that salvation was by faith alone, through grace alone. And of course, it was those words of Luther that John Wesley, the staunch legalist, another man who was trying to work out his salvation and was deeply troubled by guilt, he had that same revival experience. Hearing those words of Luther that, what was it? Faith is God's work in us. That's what it was. Faith is God's works in us. And John Wesley said he had a strange warming of the heart, and that changed England and it changed the world. It changed everything. A man burdened by guilt. And, I just think a lot of folks today are burdened by guilt. And I think there's so much potential today. So I keep my nation in my prayers. I keep our leaders in our prayers. If you don't like the people in office, and I think that, that's the thing. Like, if you like the people in office, pray for them anyways. But if you don't like the people in office, I think that's all the more reason to pray for them. Pray that even if you don't like them, that they can still get a good policy passed. Keep our leaders in our prayers. I even keep foreign leaders in our prayers. I keep the King of England in my prayers. He is the head of the Church of England, and I don't think he's a Christian, to be honest. I can't judge that definitively, but I don't think he is one. But he is the head of the Church of England, and we should keep him in our prayers anyways. We need to keep England in our prayers, keep Europe in our prayers, keep, of course, our own nation in our prayers. We need to pray for our nation. Anyways, that's all I got to say today. God bless. Thanks for watching, and Christ will conquer.